as we get close to the end of this first pre-season week with not everything available and unlocked for the season, it's time players start getting into the min-maxing of their characters, specifically when it comes to gear, right? Many players still are sitting on quite a few power increases, like for example they haven't crafted anything yet with their sparks. In a couple of days you will be getting your first Great Vault of the season with a higher item level reward. Some players might even be sitting on their 610 item level PvP crafts as well, and that's when you start getting the questions on where to craft your gear, which items would give you the best yield to get, for example, from the Great Vault. What about the Catlayst? Which items to Catlayst? Which slots would be better to craft first, etc, etc. That's what we're going to be touching today as we get close to the first important reset of the expansion, because we have to immediately start with the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is called Darkmoon Sigil Ascension. For those who are not aware, this embellishment is practically the best in slot embellishment for 95% of the specs. It is such a best in slot embellishment that the second best in slot embellishment doesn't even do anything. The point of the second best in slot is to simply empower even more your first best in slot item, because that's what the riding armor banding is going to do as your second embellish. Now the elephant in the room in question is that this Darkmoon Sigil Ascension can only be crafted on your weapon. So it has created this odd and weird situation where most specs and most players don't even want to loot any weapons. They don't even want to get your special, rare, unique weapon from the raid, because their plan was to get their weapon crafted, because that's the only way for you to get yourself your Ascension embellishment. Now the second problem is that at the moment we have 2 Sparks of Omens. So technically we could be getting 2 items crafted, let's say 2 rings, or necklace and ring, or cloak and boots, or whatever. But 2-handed weapons cost 2 sparks, not 1, which means to get this Ascension embellished huge weapon crafted, you will have to spend both of your sparks, which will leave you without any sparks to craft yourself your second embellishment. Now this is offset if you did, for example, something like we mentioned with PvP gear. You could have gotten your heraldries from PvP to craft yourself, for example, a 610 item level bracers with the embellishment, or a 610 item level belts with the banding embellishment, so that in preparation for when you were going to craft your big weapon with 2 sparks and you had no more sparks left to craft anything for your second embellish, you still have the second embellish power that you crafted with your PvP gear. That is also a very good and useful thing to get ready for at the beginning of this season. There is also the other caveat, which is if you got yourself a high item level offhand by the end of this week, or more likely at the beginning of the next week, for example from the Great Vault, or perhaps one of the early Mythic Plus keys you will be doing. If you get yourself a good offhand, whether it is an actual offhand, a shield, or another one of your one-handed weapons to use if you are dual wielding, in that case then you can ditch crafting the 2-handed weapon, because you already have a good offhand, so you can craft yourself a one-handed weapon with the Ascension embellishment, which only costs 1 spark, which leaves you with 1 more spark, which allows you to craft another high item level item with your second embellishment there. That's the first caveat to be had when talking about crafting, because of this uniqueness of the strongest embellishment coming from weapons. So the caveat number 1 being, if you do indeed plan to craft yourself a 636 mythic level weapon with the best embellishment in the game, then you will gain a lot by doing the whole PvP strat of getting yourself a 610 crafted PvP gear to get the second embellishment crafted, since you won't have enough sparks after crafting the 2-handed weapon. And then the other caveat is, if you do already have a good item level offhand weapon, then you might as well just craft a one-handed weapon, so you have 1 more spark to craft yourself another high item level piece of armor to put the other embellishment on. Then there is also of course going to be the question of the Great Vault. Now, depending on the type of content you have been doing this week, as we touched on already quite a few times before this reset, the best avenue for item level would have been doing delves, because in this reset, 616 item level is the Great Vault reward from doing tier 8 and above delves. So that is already your best reward, far outclassing the Vault reward you can get from Mythic 0, which would be 603 item level, and on par with the reward you can get from the raid, because the raid heroic ranges from 610 to 619. So on average, the delves are actually slightly higher than the raid rewards in heroic. So much of the logic from the vault is of course very simple, very easy to understand. Like for example, tier pieces are not very valuable because you expect to put a tier piece in there. Weapon pieces, as we already mentioned, are also not going to be very valuable because you plan on crafting a weapon in there with the embellishment. You might already start tinkering with your slots. For example, sure, the tier set slots are not very usable, but I already have 2 tier pieces, plus I have one that I will get from Ahead of the Curve token for free, plus I have a Catlayst charge. So technically one of those tier piece slots, even if it's not a tier piece, could come in handy. That's another thing worth considering. Then you also have to consider, perhaps depending on your role and depending on the content you do, because for example, if you are a healer, and if you are raiding, you are very unlikely to be getting much of any gear over DPS specs. So the more of your gear is in contention with other DPS specs, the harder it is for you to actually get it from the raid, meaning it will have more value from the vault. Even for a DPS, you already know which are going to be the most contested trinkets, for example, or the most contested rings or necklaces because of their secondary stats. So perhaps you might have to pass on 1, 2, 3 or 4 of those drops, which might take you like, a month to happen. So there might be a case where you get a vault option where technically your strongest upgrades would be a belt or a chest piece or a pair of pants. However, you also know those things can drop quite easily in Mythic Plus. They can drop in the raid, your raid roster. You are a leather class, you only have 3 more leather players in your group, so it's not that there's going to be much contention for those pieces. Meanwhile, the Great Vault also gave you a best in slot ring with crit and haste, which are your best in slot stats. You know, crit and haste are also contested by approximately 74 people in your guild, meaning unless you are the raid leader's e-girl, you're not gonna get that ring for quite a few weeks from the raid. So your best option to get that ring would be from the Great Vault. This is a similar reason why you should give more value to crafting these type of items with sparks rather than generic armor. So necklaces and rings as well as weapons have a much higher value compared to the other pieces because the other pieces are divided by armor types. So even if the loot whore mage who always gets the loot in the raid or the guildmaster's friend who is a warrior, they can't come and steal your leather loot in the raid because it's a completely different armor type. But for more contested pieces like necklaces, rings, trinkets and even weapons, that is when it will become more valuable for you to either craft with sparks and whatnot or to get from the Great Vault. Somewhat similar, although it doesn't happen nearly as often, is true also in Mythic Plus. You are more likely to be traded in Mythic Plus, some generic leather pieces, some generic boots or some cloak in Mythic Plus, than to be traded an actually good ring in Mythic Plus, or a good necklace in Mythic Plus, or even a weapon in Mythic Plus. So being aware of these type of min-maxing bits is actually going to improve your power level next week by being able to either get yourself some crafted items or some rewards from the Great Vault, which you would have been more unlikely to receive elsewhere, whether it was from Mythic Plus or from the raid. And that goes for both the Spark crafts that you can get, 619 if you are using the Heroic crest or 636 if you are using the Mythic crest, as well as the Catlayst. Now, the other question, this is another one that has seen some debate over time, is what do you craft with your sparks, the Mythic one or the Heroic one? Now, to some players, the answer is obvious. Why are you asking me this if the Heroic craft is 619 item level and the Mythic craft is 636? One is 17 item levels higher than the other. Why is that even an option? Well, the reason why this is an option is because multiple players do indeed craft the Heroic Crest crafted item at a much lower item level than the Mythic one. And that's because even though these are crafted items, they are still costing crests. So you're not getting those crafts for free. You are exchanging being able to upgrade gear with crests in exchange for actually crafting one. So the logic behind crafting the Mythic piece is, of course, I want this one to be my big two-handed weapon for the tier. I'm not gonna change it. I put my Ascension Embellish on it. It's gonna stay there for like 4 months for the tier, and I'm done. Someone else might be going a different direction. I have 2 sparks. I'm gonna craft 2 Mythic level rings. You know, I really want crit and haste, so I'm gonna craft 2 rings with crit and haste, Mythic item level, and then I'm done. I'm never gonna get these rings from the raid. There is like 15 other people who want crit and haste rings, so I'm gonna get them crafted at 636 and I'm done. That's one strategy. The other strategy is to get the heroic crafts simply because as you keep getting into Mythic Plus at higher level and even Mythic Raid, it will be less and less likely for you to have a use for the Heroic Crests, right? Because Heroic Crests cap at 619. Once you get into Mythic raiding altogether, those will of course only require the Mythic crests, the Gilded Harbinger crests. So the logic is because heroic crests are getting outdated week by week more and more, I'm gonna spend them to craft gear at 619 item level and then keep all of my mythic crests to actually upgrade the gear I loot. That is the other angle you can go at when looking at which types of crests to spend. Now, in general, as a very generic rule, the best way is to get yourself the mythic crafted item, simply because crafting the heroic crafted item implies you expect to be getting loot that requires mythic crest to be able to upgrade it. So cool, the season begins, you have 90 mythic raiding level crests ready to use, but you get into the mythic raid and you get 0 items. So what are you doing with those crests? You know, what use are they going to have? Well, the answer is nothing. You have nothing to use them on. Meanwhile, if you did the opposite, if you got those crests to spend them with mythic crests, and then you only had heroic crests left to use them for your upgrades, well, then you would have way more uses for, because heroic goes from 610 item level all the way up to 619. So practically everything you will be looting from Mythic Plus. You know, going from Mythic Plus 7 to 8, which is already quite challenging, that's gonna be upgraded with the heroic crests. Or continuing to clear the heroic raid. That will also require heroic crests to upgrade. So you have a much more certain avenue of spending all of your crests if you get the crafted item with the mythic crests, because the heroic crests are much easier to spend. The other way around is harder. You know, spending the heroic crests to then save your mythic crests for upgrading your gear, it's gonna take more time because it's gonna take you more time to get more and more mythic level pieces to upgrade. You would have to wait gear from the mythic raid, or you would have to wait gear from the vault at mythic level that can be upgraded. Otherwise, you won't really have much use for those crests. These are pretty much the most relevant point for the upcoming reset. Which items to, you know, to focus for both your crafting as well as your catalyst as well as your Great Vault rewards. As mentioned, putting more focus on the weapon because of how powerful the embellishment is going to be. A couple of caveats depending on whether or not you have an offhand weapon already ready to use, and especially making use of the PvP craft to get yourself a second embellishment anyways, even if you have to spend both of your sparks for a single two-handed weapon. The logic on focusing more on things like necklaces or rings or trinkets when it comes to Great Vault, or even PvP crafted gear, or even the 610 rewards from the delves that might have more value in those slots over others because of how much more competition you will have in trying to get those slots in a raid. as well as finally the pros and cons on either crafting your gear at heroic level to save your mythic crests for your upgrades, or the other way around, crafting a mythic piece to save your heroic crests for the upgrades. These are pretty much the focuses you should have for the beginning of the next week when it comes to min-maxing the power level on your character and on your gear hunting at the beginning of the next reset. But for today, we're not quite there yet on this Monday, so we can now leave each other in peace. We're starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with everyone else who is supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, done with all these things, thank you guys again for watching, see you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, that's not looking good. Why am I already hungry if I woke up 3 hours ago? I'm supposed to be eating in like 8 hours.